So next speaker is Kelsey Granger. Dr. Kelsey Granger is a historian of China and the wider Silk Road, specializing in material culture, gender, and environmental history. She is currently a Humboldt Research Fellowship at Ludwig Maximilians University, Munich, where she is working with excavated documents to access the lives of postal horses on the fringes of China's Han Empire. She is the recipient of the 2023 Sir George Staunton Prize for an outstanding article by an early Korea scholar. Okay, Kelsey, would you like to share your screen?
So thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm really excited to be part of the Fables from Asia panel today and hope to introduce you to some hopefully very interesting tales from medieval China. So China, particularly medieval China, has no shortage of moral stories and didactic tales, which involve animals as key characters. In the majority of cases, humans are ever-present actors and characters, unlike Aesop's fables where only animals take the stage. So it's a lot like the stories we just heard about. Despite being arguably main or major characters, the animals also rarely ever speak. But that does not mean that they were silent. We'll see clever tricks used throughout the narratives today that give animals the power to express, to explain, and to emote. The tales I'll be focusing on in my presentation today all revolve around the concept of debt, mostly financial in nature, and show how death was no obstacle to repayment. We'll also see how animal experiences, particularly those of domestic animals, were co-opted by and for human audiences. I should note that I am a historian rather than a literary specialist, so please forgive any literary faux pas I may make, and I hope you enjoyed the selection of fables and tales that I'll be recounting throughout my presentation. So I first just wanted to briefly set the scene for when and where these tales of debt and death emerged. There are 25 odd death and debt stories that I've been working on, which are recorded in collections or anthologies produced during China's Tang Dynasty or shortly thereafter. And you can see the map of the Tang Dynasty here. However, it's likely that the stories circulated for some time before they were actually written down and recorded. This is because a lot of the tales are very, very similar, with only minor changes to names or places. The plot essentially remains the same. These stories were therefore likely part of oral storytelling traditions, open to elaboration and localization, which resulted in the variations that we see today. This time period also marks the zenith of Buddhist influence in China. As we will see, the stories are all heavily influenced by Buddhist beliefs and tropes and explore the permeability of the borders between human and animal, connecting with and blending Chinese supernatural stories with Indian Jataka tales. So these are, in a sense, global fables as well, connecting India and China. So I will refrain from giving a very in-depth explanation of all things Buddhist here and just stick to what you're going to need to know for these stories. So the essential linchpin is that humans and other life forms are stuck in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. There are 6 paths or choices of what you can be reborn as. The bodhisattva named Kitsegarbha is depicted here in the center. Is charged with instructing those in the 6 worlds. You can see the options radiating from his body, and not all of them are very good options. So you could be reborn into hell, which I think is this man down at the bottom. I don't know if you can see my mouse, this little man at the bottom. You can be reborn into the mortal world as a hungry ghost, as an animal, as an asura, as a man, or as a deva. To escape this cycle, you must become enlightened, literally a Buddha, meaning enlightened one. As we will see, the stories in my presentation all involve a person being reborn from a human to an animal, and therefore remaining stuck in this cycle of death and rebirth. Another key theme is that of vegetarianism or abstaining from meat and alcohol. Many of the stories also orbit around Buddhist monasteries, temples, and monks who witness or verify that the story really happened and can be located in the real world. But these fables are also situated against a rich backdrop of supernatural stories and accounts from the Chinese literary tradition. China has a long history of ghost stories, which revolve around the concepts of first, bao, or retribution, and secondly, of truth, or plausibility. The concept of bao is quite difficult to explain, but it becomes very obvious in action. Bao is essentially a neutral concept. If you do good, good things happen. If you do bad, bad things will happen. It's a kind of gravitational power that seeks to balance out forces. So in our stories, it will be the debt itself, and particularly how said debt was acquired, that needs to be repaid and rebalanced. The second concept is of plausibility, or that supernatural occurrences are both fantastical and believable. There are real-world signifiers or witnesses that can verify what happened. This can be objects, eyewitness accounts, or quite literally writing on the walls, or in this instance, in the fur. Finally, dreams are situated as key spaces where truths and identities can be revealed, and particularly where non-humans can speak. It's quite difficult to fully separate the Buddhist from the local, as these belief structures were very tightly enmeshed during this time period, and you'll see these cropping up in various blends throughout the stories today. But I hope this sets the scene for the morally laden fables of debt and death that I will be sharing with you today. So, as I said, the basic premise of these 25 odd fables I've been working on is that a person dies, leaving a debt unpaid or a financial crime unpunished. With this imbalance in mind, the person is reborn as an animal to repay the debt. These stories follow three basic paths for punishment and repayment. We have reborn to die, reborn to suffer, and reborn to buy narratives. I will kick things first off with the very fun reborn to die narratives. So the first story I'd like to share is that of the greedy piglet. Now, none of these stories actually have titles as we would think of them. Normally, the title would simply be the main person or the main victim of the financial crime, but I've decided to give them more fun titles so that we can distinguish them more easily. So the tale of the great greedy piglet goes that there were 4 siblings living together in a hamlet near Yizhou City. The second oldest brother was named Tian, and he was a bit of a bad apple. He was lazy and hung about with the wrong crowd. One day, their mother was about to go out to market when Tian spied her money in the hall. Seeing no one around, he stole the money and fled. When the mother came back into the hall, she saw the money had disappeared and gathered all members of the household, including the servants. When they said they didn't know what had happened to the money, she beat the servants hard. Soon after, Tian died. A short while later, the family's pig gave birth to a piglet. In the 8th month, with the sacrifice to the god of soil imminent, the family sold the pig to a neighboring village's master of sacrifices to be slaughtered. Just then, the mother dreamed that someone came to her professing that the piglet was in fact Tian. Tian confessed to stealing the money and having the servants unduly punished, adding that he had become a pig to repay the debt. He explains that he will soon be killed by the master of sacrifices and that his mother must rescue him. The mother awoke and couldn't believe what she had dreamed, so she roused the servant girl, who confessed to dreaming the exact same thing. As dawn broke, they ordered the eldest brother to ransom the master of sacrifices for the piglet, which died 2 years later. A monk from a nearby temple saw this piglet and reported it to be true. So, as you can see, Tian died having committed a financial crime, here stealing money. He's reborn as a pig and threatened with imminent death. Oddly, his family ends up paying more money just to rescue him. The balance of debts is something I will return to a little later. So a second reborn to die narrative, here of the bowing goat, further emphasizes how a crime could be made visible in typical or untypical animal bodies and behaviors. So this story tells of Wang Zhen, who is from Anjia County, and he was a silversmith. Once he was making something for the local temple and was given 500 rolls of silk in payment. At that time, someone took 10 rolls without Wang's knowledge, and that person later died. Sometime afterwards, the Wang family was staging a ritual and bought a goat to slaughter. The goat kept kneeling down, which Wang found odd. That night, as Wang was falling asleep, someone pounded on his door, but when he looked, no one was there. This happened again, and Wang went back to bed. Just then, the door opened and a man walked in saying, "In the past, I worked with you making goods for the temple, but I stole 10 rolls of silk without your knowledge. Now I have become a goat and you are about to kill me. Please spare my life." He then kowtowed or banged his head against the ground again and again before turning to walk away and transforming into a goat. Just then, Wang's younger sister came running in, saying she'd seen a man kowtowing just like Wang had. They then released the goat into the wild and both abstained from eating meat from that day on. So this story shows how strange animal behavior, here bowing or kneeling, could be connected with the crime that was committed in their previous human life, reinterpreting kneeling with begging for forgiveness. There are other instances where the crime leaves a physical trace in the animal form. So, for instance, a young girl dies after having stolen her mother's jewelry. She's reborn as a goat with white markings like the hairpins on the side of her head. Most of these reborn to die narratives involve freeing, rescuing, or releasing the animal before its inevitable death. But in some cases, this could not be prevented. There's a particularly ghoulish story of a father unwittingly killing and eating his daughter who was reborn as a goat, which is not a nice one to think about. So we're going to move on from the reborn to die narratives to the reborn to suffer tales, which center primarily around oxen. These are the most prone to localization and elaboration, so I'm going to share the most typical oxen story. So there was once a man named Tong An Yu who became very rich, but he started life poor and was good friends with a man named Guo Gong. Once, Gong lent him 60 or 70,000 cash, with which An Yu started buying and selling sutras, becoming very rich. However, An Yu refused to pay his debt. Gong burnt incense and cried to heaven, "Tong An Yu has received my kindness, but he's forgotten justice. He won't return the money he borrowed. I want An Yu to be made an ox after he dies as a way to repay this." His words were very sincere and bitter. An Yu responded, "If I do not repay Guo Gong's money, I wish to be made a white ox after death to repay him." After a month, An Yu died. 6 months later, Gong's household ox bore a white calf, and on its left flank was black fur, which clearly spelt out the name Tong An Yu. From a distance, people heard of this, and many spectators came. Soon, An Yu's wife and relatives came to see. So great was their shame, they brought gold brocade and urged Gong to accept it as a ransom for the calf. Guo Gong was indignant at their bullying and ultimately would not accept their offers. He took the ox and calf and separated them in a small pen. An Yu's family tried to steal the calf away, but Gong installed guards so they couldn't obtain the calf. So this story has many variants, perhaps a dozen, but essentially always involves a calf with the person's name written in fur as proof of its identity. In the majority of cases, as here, the oxen becomes a spectacle viewed by the public, even in some cases inciting them to donate to the temple and renounce evil. The suffering aspect is often that of shame. The person's identity in animal form is made clear by the writing in the fur, and they often become very public animals, discussed, viewed, and visited by locals and people from further afield. As a result of this public shaming, the family often try and buy the calf for extortionate amounts of money, but this is often refused. Again, I will return to the balancing of debts across lifetimes in a moment. So a second narrative of the reborn to suffer variation does not have any variants and seems to be a unique anecdote and a far more brutal story of suffering and infamy. So there was once a man named Liu Ziran who was charged with gathering conscripts for the army. He once visited Huang Zhixian and his wife, hoping to force Huang into service. He was taken by how beautiful Huang's wife's hair was and said that if he was given a lock of her hair, he would make sure that Huang was not signed up to the army. Huang wanted to refuse, but his wife declared, hair can grow back, but a life once lost is lost forever. What good is my hair if you die in the army? She then cuts a lock of her hair and gives it to Huang to give to the commander. However, Liu did not keep his promise, and Huang was still conscripted and died in battle. For many years, his wife bitterly beseeched heaven to help her. Soon, Liu Ziran died, and that year, the Huang family donkey suddenly gave birth to a colt. On its left flank, its fur spelt the name Liu Ziran. The news spread like wildfire, and eventually the local magistrate summoned her and the donkey. Liu's son also came and declared that his father loved to eat meat and drink alcohol in life. If the donkey did the same, then he would accept that the donkey was his father. They put meat and alcohol in front of the donkey, and it drank gallons and it ate tons, giving out a long, mournful bray when it was finished. The son, convinced, sought to buy the donkey for hundreds of thousands cash, but the wife refused. She instead beat it every day until its fur fell out in patches, declaring this would be enough to repay her husband's death. Liu's son died of shame. So this is a very brutal example of bao, or retribution, in action. The debt of her hair is repaid by the donkey's balding and painful welts. So before I turn to the final narrative trope of the reborn to buy stories, I'd like to show statistically how these narratives repay their debts, as it sheds light on how repayment is framed in these fables. So if we start with the reborn to die narratives, we see no stories involve the debt being exceeded. 2 balance the debt, or normally involving stolen jewelry being discovered. None involve the family being denied access to the animal to rescue them. And 1 has a double debt, which is the piglet story, where he steals money from the family, and then the mother then pays again for the piglet, doubling the financial loss. The reborn to suffer narratives do a little better on balancing their books. So we can see that 1/4 of the debts are balanced, but 1/4 of the debts are also refused. This is where a family ransoms the animal, but is denied access. So what we can see from this is that the concept of repayment and debt is not a one-to-one equivalence. More intangible debts, like the balding donkey, or elsewhere there's a violent mother who is reborn as a dog which is beaten. These are very neat one-to-one bowel retribution narratives. But when money, land, or other commodities form the debt, it seems the shame of becoming a domestic animal, particularly one that was overtly identifiable, was repayment enough. Extortionate ransoms of money that would equal or surpass the original debt were not as highly valued as having the animal itself. So this brings us to the final narrative trope, the reborn to buy narratives, which all involve fine steeds and fine horses. As you can see, we have a far higher hit ratio here. The debts are far larger, as high as 200,000, and are achieved not via ransom, but just through the direct sale of the reborn horse to wealthy or elite military men. In comparison to the suffering oxen, money was actually more valuable than the animal itself. The animal experience of being a horse was not payment enough. So I will give a final example of a debt-to-death fable today, which is about the district magistrate Wei Youro. So he had a servant girl who was charged with managing the horse equipment. When she was 20 or so, she grew ill and died. Youro had a visitor who was a religious specialist. He suddenly dreamed the servant girl came to him and said, "I've encountered misfortune and died, but I still owe my master 45,000 cash. I will become a horse, which is a strange color, to repay the debt." The next year, a horse gave birth to a white colt with black eyes, which had the servant girl's ways. It's not very clear what they mean by this. A number of years later, the horse grew to be a fine, valuable steed. Yoro's colleague, Pei Quan, saw this white horse and wanted to buy it. He asked what it was worth, and Yoro asked for 30,000, which Kwan accepted. Yoro said to himself, "This servant girl still owes me another 15,000. I ought to seek more money in the future." A number of days later, Kwan came back and said to Yoro, "This horse is a really good horse. I feel what I paid you before was too low." And he then gave Yoro another 15,000. The matter was thus resolved. So what's different here? First of all, it's not a reborn to die narrative. The horse is not going to be slaughtered. There are no visible markers that connect the horse with the person, just a kind of hint of their mannerisms. So the horse does not become a spectacle to be viewed by the public. Thirdly, there is no family intervention seeking to ransom the horse out of shame. What these three reborn to die narratives, all involving fine horses being sold, tell us is that horses were valuable, able to be sold for very high amounts of money. Furthermore, the debt is balanced by the books, not via humiliation, shame, or infamy. To be reborn as a horse was not deemed to be the same as being reborn as an oxen or as a goat. As fantastical as these fables may be, these distinctions reveal how they were intimately connected with the realities of domestic animal use and domestic animal meanings. So, having introduced these various tropes to you, you may be wondering, so what? What do we learn about animals from these myriad stories of debt and death? Well, first is that these animals are domestic and ubiquitous. None of the debts are settled by rebirth into a wild or unseen animal. The debt is paid publicly, but also using familiar animals and familiar animal experiences. Second, we see animals being grouped by their presumed use in domestic spaces. So the reborn to die narratives center solely on goats and pigs, which were meat animals doomed to be killed. The reborn to suffer narratives nearly all focus on oxen, who were subject to heavy labor, but also dogs, donkeys, even perhaps a horse that was subject to use, abuse, beasts of burden, things like this. Finally, the reborn to buy narrative centers solely on fine horses. The audience is familiar with these species, but especially familiar with how such animals are used, abused, beaten, or killed throughout their lives. They can immediately access and imagine the distinct trajectory of an oxen or a goat or a horse, but they don't particularly individualize the animals within these categories. It's the general trend, the general arc that's the focus of these narratives. Moreover, there is a noteworthy ghoulish violence and fascination that underlies the moral messages of repayment and retribution. We know, and the audience knows, these animals were once humans, blurring the acceptability of killing, beating, or consuming these animals. The boundaries between human and animal, while permeable, are unpleasant to imagine reversed. This is made evident by how the animals are given room to explain and emote. We hear anthropomorphized fear and desperation as a piglet pleads for its life, as a goat bows for forgiveness, and as a donkey brays mournfully as it eats meat and drinks alcohol. The animals speak with anthropomorphized emotions from a human perspective of real animal experiences. The balancing of debts also informs us how the lives of beasts of burden like oxen were deemed to be miserable, humiliating experiences, while fine horses were exempt from such shame and were instead highly valuable commodities. In all, reading these fables sheds light on the blending of Indian Buddhist and local Chinese concepts of rebirth, retribution, and repayment. But when we focus on the animals, we see that storytellers used and imagined different domestic animals to plausible and ghoulish effect. It's no wonder that spectators visiting reborn calves sought to renounce evil and donate to the temple. The human reborn to suffer humiliation, labor, and ultimately an animal experience was a stark warning against debt and deceit, a punishment terrible enough to be imagined. So before I finish this talk up, if this has piqued your interest and you want to know more about Chinese animals and Chinese animal studies, I'm the co-founder of the Chinese Animal Studies Network. We very recently launched, just last week, our website, Twitter account, and mailing list, where we share recent publications, upcoming events, and related animal studies news. So do feel free to check us out. Thank you again, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.